See the fourth question. Vulnerability is an essential element for defining disaster impacts and its threat to people. Okay. How and in what ways can vulnerability to disasters be characterized? So actual question starts here. How and in what ways can vulnerability to disaster be characterized? Discuss different types of vulnerability with reference to disasters. So, okay, it's reasonably easy question, but here the main focus is on the vulnerability. Just take this for 2 minutes and then we'll discuss. Yes. So what are the characteristics of vulnerability? Basically, the question is divided into two parts. First are the characteristics of the vulnerability and then the types of vulnerability. Okay, different types of vulnerability. So in what are the characteristics of vulnerability? What are the characters of vulnerable region? How do you characterize the vulnerability? Most of you have seen the answers. They are directly, for this answer, you people have directly jumped into the second half of the question, that is different types of vulnerability. So basically you can start the answer by explaining what is vulnerability. Okay. And then you can say that how there are various organizations nationally and internationally. In nationally, we have the Disaster Management Force, NDRF. Internationally, we are part of important risk mitigation and disaster mitigation frameworks like the Sendai framework up to 2030. It is there. So you can say that this is there. And then what are the characteristics of vulnerability? Vulnerable areas or vulnerability is characterized with regard to its, for example, if you are saying zone 4 or zone 5 is more vulnerable than zone 2, what is the characteristics which we are trying to define? What is the character we are trying to define? Intensity. If zone 5 is more when compared to zone 2, it means it's in intensity. That is the impact or intensity. So that is one of the important part where your vulnerability is characterized. Then what is the next part of the vulnerability? First is the intensity. Second thing is the spread. How far it is spread also makes it more vulnerable. So second is the spread. Intensity spread. Okay, and here it is impact. Intensity is different, impact is different. Intensity may be 100, but how many people it is going to impact and how far it is spread. These are the characteristics of vulnerability. Some important characteristics of vulnerability. And then different types of vulnerability are the physical vulnerability, social vulnerability, economic vulnerability, and finally the environmental vulnerability. So these are the standard divisions given by the international organizations like UNDRR, Disaster Recovery and Response, Risk Reduction, Disaster and Risk Reduction, UNDRR, United Nations Disaster and Risk Reduction is the body. So they have given physical, social, economic, and environmental vulnerabilities. So what is physical vulnerability? Basically, the movement of people from because of vulnerable areas is the physical vulnerability. Okay. Basically, based on the population there, how many people are living there, and if there is a disaster, how many people are impacted, how many have to be moved. All this is the physical vulnerability. Then what is the social vulnerability? It is based on the characteristics of various people. For example, an old man might be more vulnerable to an earthquake than a very young person, because a young person can actually run away to a safer place when compared to old person. And household women may be more vulnerable than the working woman. So like that, the vulnerability socially also differs. A small child may be more vulnerable than a young teenager. So that is the social vulnerability. Next, what is the economic vulnerability? Economic status. A person may construct earthquake resistant building or home, but a poor hut dweller might be facing a direct impact of vulnerability. So that is the economic vulnerability. And then finally, the environmental vulnerability. A region in Western Ghats is more vulnerable to disasters when compared to a region in Gangetic Plain. Okay, Gangetic Plain may be vulnerable to floods, but then the region in Western Ghats is more vulnerable to various things like earthquake, landslides, and other issues. So from region to region, the vulnerability varies. That is the environmental vulnerability. So all these are important components of different types of vulnerabilities. And then you can conclude by saying, when again, you can use the same conclusion of the first question here. By having proper vulnerability profiling or zonation mapping and risk assessment of various areas, we can try to mitigate the disasters to the great extent possible. And then the need of the hour is to help increase our understanding about the disasters. Who has written the fourth question? Whose questions not discussed last class? Anyone written the fourth question? Please raise your hand. Whose questions not discussed in the last class? And then you have written different types of vulnerability. Okay. But then what about the characteristics of vulnerability? You have missed that. You have to write the characteristics of vulnerability. You have not written it. Conclusion can be slightly trimmed. It's a very big conclusion. Okay, you can maybe last point you can merge with the second point. Development and funds should be properly planned.